Hello, I'm Eric Holmquist, and welcome back to ERM Advantage and part 3 in our series on the enterprise and operational risk assessments, and the second part of our subsegment around the operational risk assessment. In the prior video, we talked about the general concepts behind the operational assessment, approach, and scope. In this video, we're going to start to dive down into the actual framework itself. In this video, we're going to actually cover the overview, and this is a critical component because it is foundational to the entire assessment as well as other aspects of the risk management program. Then in the next video, we'll actually dive into the risk register, rating risks, documenting them, etc., and then following that on aggregating all the information. Now, obviously, as you can see, I'm trying to break these up into roughly half-hour segments. I'm very respectful of people's time and appreciate that people don't necessarily have 3 hours to watch a full-length coverage of this topic, so hopefully this way you can kind of break this up into some pieces as you go. So again, a lot to cover today around the overview section, so let's get into it. Okay, so we've established our list of business units, we've defined the scope of our assessment, we've come up with our team of players, our participants, and we're ready to begin our assessment workshops. We've managed communication, set expectations for everybody, and we've got our workshops scheduled. So we begin. Once we begin the workshop, we obviously want to establish some basic rules of engagement. First and foremost, be present, be engaged, but also be respectful. Everyone's voice matters, and we'll consider everybody's input. Honesty is critical. This process really doesn't work if people aren't willing to be transparent and honest. But remember, just because we talk about something or put it on the table doesn't mean it goes in a document. It just means we're going to talk about it. It's important to understand that honesty cannot and will not be persecuted. It will not be punished. In fact, it will be rewarded. We need to be able to look at ourselves openly and honestly. Ask questions, particularly if anything doesn't make sense. Remember, this is your assessment, and so it needs to make sense to you. And in order to be engaged, if something doesn't make sense, ask questions. Remember, the purpose of this exercise is for us to help find an equilibrium between instinct and controls. We're not just going for no risks, just the right ones. We're just as interested in process improvement as we are risk mitigants. Throw it out there. If you think there's a way that this process could be improved, let us know. Put it on the table. That's absolutely in scope for this conversation. And observations aren't just limited to your business unit. And upstream and downstream dependencies are just as in scope. You may find that the challenges arrive in how a process arrives to you and where it goes after it leaves your office. That's fine as well. Remember, there are no right answers. Risk assessments are, by definition, somewhat subjective, and our goal is to try and reduce some of that subjectivity. But we appreciate that you need to be able to consider a variety of views. Just, again, there's no right, there's no wrong. The ink never dries on this analysis, and this is really important to understand because sometimes people feel like once I say it and you write it down, it's cast in stone. No, it's your assessment. We can change this at any time and for any reason. You could wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, now that I've thought about it, I want to reframe that part. Fine, this is yours. We're just trying to get something together we can start with and work with, but again, you can change it whenever. And finally, be open-minded. We don't know everything. We trust your experience, your instincts, but we're not going to bet the bank on it. Never be afraid to ask the question, what if I'm wrong? Now, note to facilitators, again, if somebody from risk or a PMO or not a consultant is facilitating, I do find it is, in fact, most effective to have the templates displayed on screen so you can capture as you go in real time. But a couple of notes. Again, do not pre-fill the forms if this is the first time. If it's a renewal, that's fine. But this is the first time, don't pre-fill to try and be helpful. If you do, you will shut down conversation. Again, the business will say, yeah, that's fine, and move on. This needs to be a discovery exercise. Second, let the participants know that you're going to be capturing information as we go along, but that nothing goes in final documents until they say so and in their voice. Until that time, These worksheets will not see the light of day, and they have to believe you in this. These are their documents, period, and only they say what goes in them and when they might be seen by a broader audience. Now, having said that, do not transcribe every word people are saying as they go along. It's going to feel like a deposition and you will shut down the conversation. Instead, capture the essence of what people are saying. It sort of looks like virtual notes in bullets or in summary form. Again, if you try and transcribe everything, you will grind the process to a halt. Just get the essence of what they're saying, the key elements, and maybe somebody else could be taking some handwritten notes as well. Then after the workshop, go back and edit that, convert that into more of a full narrative form before you distribute it back to the business for their review. And finally, I strongly recommend that you not record these workshop sessions. Now, you may think from an efficiency standpoint that would be a useful reference as we go back later and edit our notes, but the consequence of that is that people will be more afraid to be candid with you and open the discussion, knowing there's a recording. As much as you tell them that no one will see this or will destroy it as soon as we're done editing, it doesn't matter. It will inhibit the conversation, and it is a bad idea, so just don't do it. In addition, keep your eye out for the following as you go along. Number one, end-to-end elements, upstream, downstream dependencies. Eventually, you're going to need to stitch these together into an entire process map end-to-end, and you're going to need to help verify assumptions between areas to make sure that the stories match. Sometimes people can be hesitant to criticize departments outside of their own, but if that's really where the problems exist, then we really need to know that. Look out for major assumptions, whether spoken or unspoken. I mean, this is really the gold you're looking for in these conversations. And certainly be mindful of body language, particularly around comfort level. Are people feeling uncomfortable? Do you get the sense that maybe they were told, don't disclose any of the bad stuff, only the good stuff? Or are they showing frustration that they've voiced these concerns before, but no one's listening? Again, we need to make sure people understand that this is a safe environment, but if all they do is just sugarcoat everything they're telling us, we're not really using this time usefully. And finally, and this can be tricky, is listen more than tell. Look, just because you know all these fancy risk terms and concepts, don't think for 1 second that you could do these people's jobs. They know how the sausage gets made. You don't need to tell them how. Never give off the impression that you're smarter than they are. Listen and hear what they have to say, and then guide them in the conversation. There may be times when you want to suggest something, but don't say, your risk is this, or your mitigant is this. Again, they'll just shut down and say, fine, you fill in the form, or tell me what you want me to say so we can get out of here. Instead, more phrases like, well, would you think this, or would you consider this, or, what about this? Again, use it to prompt conversation, but don't fill in the blanks for them. Okay, starting with our overview. And this can be one of the most important steps in the process for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's grounded in the language of the business. So it gives us the context for everything else we're going to talk about. It gets the business unit comfortable talking. Again, if we can start the exercise in familiar territory, in familiar terms, it makes it so much easier to move into more complex areas later on. So first we're going to walk through each of the pieces kind of conceptually, and then we're going to go back and we'll look at a very practical example for one. Okay, starting with what do you do? And it's amazing to me how many times I've seen risk assessments that didn't cover this. And it may seem like, well, it's obvious, everybody knows that, but it isn't obvious. And it's a really important part of our assessment because it does give us context for all the other elements. Every business unit should be able to articulate their function. What does your group do, and how does that support the overall business strategy? In other words, how does your business unit specifically fit into achieving of the institution's key strategic objectives? And as an aside, if you combine the answers from all the different business units on this question, the collective response should reflect the means by which the strategic goals will be met, and if not, something's missing. Next, What's changing in your area? As I've said before and will say many times again, the seeds of risk are always sown in change. Changes might include planned expansions, new technology, process re-engineering, taking on new responsibilities, etc. This is important because it supports a conversation around the potential risk associated with those changes, which includes both the design of the proposed future state, similar to our other strategic macro risks, as well as the new operating environment and new process risks that may come from that. For instance, when it comes to assessing specific processes within the business unit, it's critical to know if that process or the environment in which it exists is going to change. We need to be able to think about what that increment might look like. Plus, this also gives us a really important takeaway from the overall assessment process, in that these planned changes should be monitored against any expected outcomes and then any associated key risks. Okay, so once we've got our basic description of the business unit defined and possibly even some major functional subsections within that, now it's time for us to get to the meat of it, which is our core processes. This is a big part of the what we know that we know part of the exercise. So going beyond just a functional description, it should be fairly easy for each business unit to articulate what are these core processes that support their primary objectives. Now, this may take a little bit of time to work out because people aren't used to describing them, but once you get going, it usually becomes fairly comfortable in figuring out what these processes are. Again, the trick is staying focused on core processes. We're not looking for every little nitty, tiny little sub-process. We're just looking for the overall processes to give us a starting place, and then we can unpack, further later on. Now, again, part of the conversation might also include things like upstream and downstream dependencies, how processes flow into and out of the business, and how does that typically go. And also, again, getting the business unit's perspective on the process themselves and could they be improved. Again, as long as we're taking time to look at operational processes, we might as well ask about whether it could be improved. Often I've spoken with business areas that openly admitted their processes were inadequate or inefficient and could benefit by some improvements, but they've never been given the time or resources to be able to make those improvements. So risk management can certainly be an advocate in this case and really encouraging those and supporting those changes because, look, a process that is not well defined will always make it inefficient. You'll never use resources efficiently and will always have a higher risk profile than one that does. So if one of the outcomes of this exercise is getting the support for the business to be able to make some process improvements, they'll be that much more supportive of the overall exercise. Okay, so up until now, we've been working in known territory. What is the business overview or description? What is it you plan to change? And what are your processes? Now we start to move into we think we know territory. Again, staying in the language of business, simply asking the question how the process should go if everything works as intended. What's the desired outcome? Now, this typically involves a discussion around each process, including the process steps and the expected outcomes. Now, you could do this process by process. What is the process? What's the expected outcome? Or you could document all the processes and then go back as a separate step and talk about expected outcomes. Doesn't matter in which order you do this. Again, this should still be fairly familiar territory. Now, a good way to approach this, because again, you might have to sort of prime the pump a little bit on the conversation because people aren't used to describing what they do and how it should go. So it's prompts like, okay, what tends to initiate or start the process? What are the steps you take along the way? What dependencies are involved? What's the product that should result from this? And then what indicates that the process is complete? Kind of your expected outcome. Again, by using some of these prompts, people usually catch on pretty quickly and are able to sort of describe what they expect to have happen, within this process and its result. Now, again, at this point, you could go through and document these for each of the processes, the expected outcomes, or you could stop after each process and move right to, okay, this is our expected outcome, and then what are some plausible alternatives, which is we're going to move into the less comfortable areas, you could do that all at one time or process by process. It doesn't matter what order you tackle it. Now, as we talk about expected outcomes, at times this is going to be spectacularly obvious, and I get that, but not always. And even if seemingly obvious, this is the context we're looking for to support a risk discussion. And as we're talking about these expected outcomes, we occasionally stumble upon some interesting, noteworthy, and at times, if not suspect, assumptions that may bear further scrutiny. This is what the facilitators want to be paying attention for, because this is where they tend to start to come out. We expect the vendor will always fill in the blank. Okay, when we start talking about expected outcomes, sometimes this is where the assumptions start to bear their head and should be noted for further discussion later on. Now, the goal here is just to give us a baseline. Again, we're not going for perfect. We're just trying to give a basic, rough understanding of what are the processes and how is it you think they should go. Okay, so once we've got expected, now we start to move into even less familiar territory, because frankly, people tend not to think like this. So, building on outcomes, outside of how you hope everything goes, what other possible outcomes are there? Now, we're not trying to document every word that comes out of their mouths. Please, just have a discussion. This may take some conversation, some massaging, some thinking things through. This is literally a throw stuff on the wall and see what sticks conversation. You might throw things out there you think are major, but they're minor. You need to work together to figure out what are a set of plausible alternatives that are kind of meaningful. While only a breath away from the dreaded what could go wrong, this also allows for the possibility that things could go better than anticipated, and if so, how? For positive outcomes, the only real question is, how could the business, exploit that outcome further or modify the process in some way to take advantage of improved outcome? This is largely on the business to consider. But in the other direction, which outcomes are considered unacceptable and should be mitigated? This is where the assessment truly begins, and we can start to introduce some risk management concepts, starting with determining which of these outcomes, if any, would be considered material risks and what could be done to mitigate them. Now, this discussion may start to give some insights into roles and responsibilities, key assumptions, etc. No, we're only talking about possible outcomes. We haven't introduced risk types yet. We'll get to that. Right now, we're only focusing on how could it go, and beyond that, which ones sort of matter. Now, this begins the part where it may take some real restraint on the part of the facilitators, because there's going to begin a temptation to start to input and correct. No, that's not a risk. Yeah, that's a risk. You have this. You need to let the business unit discover for themselves. Now, keep in mind, this is not one and done. We're going to be talking about these concepts for a while, and as we get deeper into the different assessment components, we're going to discover new things. We can come back anytime and consider new aspects, new outcomes, etc. We're just trying to give us a place to start. So we need to give them that space, but even if you realize I might have missed something, again, you may say, have you considered this? Is this a possibility? But when the business says done, be done. We can come back to this section later on. Now we move into particularly unfamiliar territory, but one of the most important territories of the entire exercise. What is your understanding of risk appetite or acceptance? Now things get interesting and worth some discussion, because this is one of the keys to taking risk management to where it needs to be. This is where the business units usually find themselves in very unfamiliar territory, which is one of the reasons why risk management is failing. We have a tendency to define risk appetite at an enterprise level, but if we don't carry that down into the business units, how do they know what level of risk is acceptable? But the fact is, there is a point when implementing controls where the business unit should be able to say, we know what the incremental risk is, the impact of that, less the cost of an additional control, so we'll document it, and if it happens, we will write the check. This is a very uncomfortable concept for a lot of people, but that is the reality. Now, having facilitated hundreds of risk assessment workshops over the years, I've found an almost universal lack of understanding that there is a certain amount of risk that a business unit can, in fact, accept. But if they are not given clear guidance on what those levels are, then they will decide for themselves. And the tolerances they set will always be more stringent than what is likely intended. In fact, in almost all cases, the implied or assumed acceptance risk level is that nothing should ever go wrong and failure will be punished. The reality is you cannot have zero risk tolerance and process efficiency at the same time. It is physically and logistically impossible. Therefore, we have to be able to provide some guidance to every business unit around acceptable risk levels. In short, how much can go wrong and still be acceptable? Now, for many, even saying that out loud sounds insane. But have you ever wondered how you got where you are with checkers of checkers of checkers? This is how you got there. In a vacuum of information, people will come to their own conclusions, and those conclusions will almost always be wrong. If this is not a normal part of the discussion with business units, then they will struggle significantly with this question, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, the conversation could stay centered around how processes could break, or this is where we could also introduce certain risk types, if only to jog discussion. How is risk acceptance seen relative to, say, compliance or operations, including financial losses, reputation, etc. If this is the first time that risk management is having this discussion with the business unit, the goal really is just little more than seeing if the business unit can give at least some abstracted description of what they consider acceptable risk. Over time, as the operational assessments mature, including defining of risk monitoring and metrics and some related thresholds, there's going to be ample opportunity to revisit this and fine-tune this concept. But for now, we're just trying to get to the idea of an awareness that there's a level that can be accepted and see if they understand that that level does exist. So once we've developed this information, we now have a strong overview of the business area and hopefully a collective understanding of their moving parts and a related risk perspective. Now you notice we haven't talked about specific risks yet. We've only talked about plausible alternative outcomes. There's a whole lot of other information about how we think about identifying and define key risks. We're going to get to that later on. As I said earlier, by focusing our initial conversation around business purpose and process, it gets a dialogue going, it gets people talking, and gets us away from the uneven, uncomfortable ground of a risk discussion onto more familiar territory. But perhaps without realizing it, we are only a breath away from talking about key risks. So before we move on, let's now look at a practical example, one of loan operations. Now, a quick note before we start. I'm going to be showing the information that's going to go in semi-final form into these actual forms. Obviously, the information that will come out of the workshops will be much more rough, bullet points, summary, and then that information gets cleaned up and translated into these forms where it will be edited down by the business. But we don't need to go through each of those steps, so we're just going to look at this information as it would look like once it went into the actual overview form. Okay. To start, what does your group do? Well, our group supports all back office processes to close and service the bank's customer and commercial loans, as well as account administration, legal process, and loan payoff and lien release. The function is critical to supporting day-to-day loan operations and must be prepared to support the portfolio growth in response to lending campaigns. Most of the processes are subject to a variety of legal and regulatory requirements. This group is made up of 37 people working in 3 U.S. locations, which comprises multiple teams, each specialized in various aspects of loan operations. Okay, this is a good sort of working understanding or elevator pitch of what this group does. But there's a couple specific things that are important here. I mean, one, it starts to support connecting end-to-end processes by understanding this is a back office process. Clearly, it connects to a larger process. Within this overview, we're starting to build out our functional and even process list as we start talking about the different pieces of what happens within this area. We note that there's a reference to regulatory requirements. So again, note there that we're going to have to deal with that in a certain risk perspective. And we noted there's some specialization, and that is good, but do they overvalue this as a mitigant versus defined controls or other mitigants? Now you'll notice here in this overview section that there's a couple other sections that can be used. One is for objectives and one for functions. For some business units, they may have very specific parts of the strategic plan and specifically individual objectives within that plan that they are responsible for or directly contributing to. So in those cases, it's sometimes a good idea to note those to track accountability to those objectives. And similarly, you may have some departments that are large, complex, and might have multiple functions within them that are discrete and among themselves, and then there are processes below that. In those cases, you might meet with this hierarchy of department and functions and processes. In our case, we'll be okay with just department and the major processes within it. So we've talked about the business area, and then we ask, what is changing? Well, over the next 12 to 18 months, the department is going to be converting to a yet-to-be-determined loan servicing system. Otherwise, no significant changes are planned. So that's fine. I mean, this gives us a good takeaway from monitoring. Make sure that the change is visible and is fully analyzed. And then, connect it to a change risk assessment. So again, we fully understand the impact of that potential change. And again, it also gives us a backdrop as we talk about the processes within the area. Certainly, we always need this kind of in our back of our mind of how is that going to be affected by this change that you're now talking about. What is your understanding of risk acceptance or risk appetite? Again, this now takes us into very unfamiliar territory typically. So I might say, well, for compliance requirements, our appetite is 0. The bank must be in compliance at all times with all applicable laws and regulations. Again, I'm not going to question this. I want to hear what they have to say. I'm going to capture whatever they offer, and we can come back and revisit all this later on. Then operationally, mistakes and errors do happen, but the impact of these cannot lead to regulatory violations or net losses of more than, say, $50,000 annually. So again, a couple things here. We're talking about appetite of 0. That's fine, but as we talk about mitigants, there's going to have to be the mitigants in place that backs that up. And we talk about a potential loss amount that seems reasonable, but does everybody agree internally and up the food chain? Now, if the stated appetite is, say, $50,000, but then somebody gets fired over a $20,000 loss for something other than, say, internal fraud, then you're not serious about risk management. The message you're sending is, we say one thing and we do another. And in this case, you haven't figured it out. The appetite for losses is 0. And you will never, ever have efficiency in your operations because that's what people will manage to. Whatever we say here is what we have to be willing to live by. Okay, what are your major processes? Okay, in this area, we've got some major functional areas, and our processes are fundamentally, ongoing account administration, loan closing and post-closing, loan servicing, loan payoff and lien release, and legal process as is needed. Now again, this seems very reasonable and about the level of detail we're looking for. We really don't need to go beyond this at this point. Again, this could be more or less detailed at the bank's discretion. There's no absolute right or wrong, but this is generally a pretty good sort of altitude for us to be looking to work at. Now, somewhat surprisingly, sometimes business units just know this information, a process list. In other cases, they might actually have to talk this through because they're not used to articulating what it is that they do. Okay, so once we have that, then we can talk about what are the expected outcomes. And we'll use one specific process as an example here. So, account administration. Administrative changes to loan records may originate from loan officers, from customer service, or within loan operations itself. There are control procedures that should be followed to ensure proper authorization and to limit what changes can be made. And then once approved, Changes are implemented by the loan ops staff, reviewed by a supervisor, and are included in a weekly change log. So again, we're starting to learn some very important things. We've identified some key control steps that often land us at what are key risks. And also, this discussion is often very, very helpful in helping us to document and clarify key roles and responsibilities. So once we have that, now we can start to think about, okay, that sounds great. What are some plausible alternative outcomes that can happen? And again, it really is a short hop from sort of what could go wrong, but we really want to focus on, it could be better, it could be worse, just sky's the limit. Tell us what could alternatively happen. So for this, number one, we could have one-off keying errors in account changes. This is a minor risk. This is a cut and a scrape. We could have delays in posting account changes. Again, kind of a minor risk. We could have account changes made without proper customer authentication. Now we're into some more moderate territory because that's something that really could have some notable implications. Or there could be an undiscovered pattern of changes made without proper authorization, whether malicious or fraudulent or just ineptitude. This really could result in a major risk if this is something that goes on for a while without being discovered. So again, talking through the various plausible outcomes, we can start to separate between what are cuts and scrapes, between what are really legitimate risks. And then the key risks will end up moving into the other register or our risk register for further analysis. Again, by talking through these questions, we begin to unearth a wealth of information to inform the risk assessment and helping the business distinguish between routine, minor versus key risks. Now, I've seen quite a few institutions that skipped over these parts and instead tried to go straight to what are your key risks. It ended in frustration every single time. The business units went kicking and screaming, but they were never really engaged, and the end result pretty much told them what they already knew. But once you have this conversation, it makes it so much easier to identify risks and get the business units engaged in the process. They feel like they owned the process because it was a process of discovery and it was in their voice. Plus, you learn a ton as you go. The real gold in a well-developed risk assessment, and it goes a long way to avoiding scenarios like we've seen in recent institution failures, where one has to really question whether there was truly a clear understanding of these key risks and whether or how those risks could have been fully mitigated. Okay, so let's just summarize the points we've covered today. First, for any assessment, make sure that your scope, foundation, focus, etc. is clearly defined and is understood by all of your participants. Be smart about organizing the list of business functions. Where there are, again, homogeneous processes, you could combine those processes, and where there are particularly complex areas, you'll obviously want to break those up into different functional areas because different people will represent those processes. Be thoughtful about workshop participants. You want that time to be productive, so really give some thought to who would be the most beneficial to contribute to the conversation in this assessment and discovery process. Actively communicate with all levels of management. This goes a long way towards gaining support, buy-in, and making sure that the message is really put out there correctly, that this is an important exercise and everyone is really encouraged to participate. Manage expectations from senior management to business unit managers to participants. Just make it very clear what is expected and what's the process and what's the outcome of this process. Again, it's appropriate for risk management to facilitate workshops. Again, can certainly serve as a subject matter expert, but mainly there as facilitator, but it is inappropriate for internal audit to participate, rather that they will be included later on as part of a review and challenge process. Next, strongly encourage honesty and transparency while creating a safe environment to do so. This process doesn't work if we don't have openness, honesty, transparency. If all people are telling you is just all the roses and sunshine, then you're really not going to accomplish anything. This may take some time for some people because they've sort of been trained to not talk about things that could go wrong or things that may not be right. But we have to create an environment to be able to do that safely. And finally, the information is in this overview. It may seem obvious, and maybe in some cases it is, but it isn't to everybody. And in the end, you'll be surprised how much really useful information we can glean from this that serves a very useful purpose throughout the rest of the assessment. Once again, this gives us a really good place to take a pause. We've covered an awful lot and gathered a lot of information, and you'll see as we go along just how important this information is. It really is very foundational to the entire assessment, and you'll see just how much we can really harvest from what we've gathered so far. Again, in the next video, we're going to dive down into the risk register and identifying key risks, documenting them, rating them, etc. And as always, feel free to leave a comment. Are there other aspects in operational assessments that you developed that are good data points that are good to gather from business areas? I'm always open to learning from others.